My name is Chloe, and at 34 years old, I am still healing from the deep emotional wounds my family inflicted. As a highly successful corporate restructuring consultant, I managed to escape their toxic environment years ago, but I foolishly maintained occasional contact out of a misplaced sense of loyalty. Last weekend, they invited me on a supposedly unifying family trip to a hyper-exclusive resort in Miami. I should have known immediately that it was a carefully orchestrated trap. Before I continue this story, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you have ever had to stand up to family members who constantly underestimated your worth and tried to diminish your light. The air conditioning inside the lobby of the Azure Grande Resort provided a sharp and sudden contrast to the suffocating and heavy Miami heat outside. I stood at the gleaming marble front desk holding my overnight bag and a polite smile. The concierge typed briskly on his keyboard, his brow slowly furrowing in deep confusion. He looked up at me with a strained and apologetic expression. "I am incredibly sorry, Mom, but there is absolutely no room reserved under your name anywhere in our system." I froze in place. Behind me, my stepmother Brenda was suddenly very interested in her luxury designer handbag, digging through it with exaggerated focus to avoid looking in my direction. Brenda had raised me since I was 2 years old after my biological mother tragically passed away, but she never once let me forget that I was an outsider in her perfect household. To her, I was just a difficult burden who needed to be managed and hidden away. My biological father, Jerome, suddenly found the lobby ceiling architecture fascinating. He was a man who owned a chain of traditional retail stores in Atlanta and loved projecting the image of a strong and successful Black patriarch to his community. But in reality, he was a deeply passive enabler who always deferred to Brenda to keep the peace in his household. He refused to meet my eyes standing there in his expensive linen vacation suit while his oldest daughter was being humiliated in public. Then my younger half-sister Jada stepped forward into my line of sight. At 29 years old, she was still playing the exact same cruel childhood games she had mastered years ago. She was the undisputed golden child of the family, the one who could do absolutely no wrong. She was clinging tightly to the arm of her husband, Trey. Jada wore a smug and victorious smile that I had seen 1,000 times before. She tossed her long hair over her shoulder and delivered the fatal blow loud enough for the other wealthy lobby guests to hear clearly. Trey paid for this entire trip to celebrate our anniversary. We only booked rooms for real family members. We simply cannot have your miserable energy ruining the vibe of our vacation. I stood completely still, processing the sheer audacity of her words. Jada had married Trey 2 years ago, and he had quickly become the family savior. Trey presented himself as a highly successful real estate investment fund executive. He drove leased luxury sports cars, wore flashy, oversized watches, and spoke constantly about building generational wealth and achieving Black excellence. He was exactly the kind of son-in-law Brenda desperately wanted to show off to the judgmental women at our church. He was loud, confident, and draped in the superficial trappings of wealth. But as a risk management professional, I read people for a living. I analyzed failing businesses and identified corporate fraud every single day. Looking at Trey adjusting his tailored cuffs with an arrogant smirk, I saw a man who was performing. I saw a fragile house of cards waiting for a single gust of wind. My family expected me to react the way I used to when I was a vulnerable teenager. They expected me to argue with them, to cry tears of rejection, to beg the concierge for a room, or to demand an explanation from my silent father. They wanted a loud public scene so they could point their manicured fingers and call me the angry and bitter Black woman who always ruined their happiness. They wanted to feel superior and justified in their cruelty. They had invited me all the way from Atlanta to Miami just to publicly humiliate me and remind me of my place at the absolute bottom of their social hierarchy. They had always dismissed my career and my life choices. To Brenda and Jada, working a corporate consulting job meant I lacked the entrepreneurial spirit they supposedly possessed. They mocked me for being single and childless at 34, treating my independence as a tragic failure rather than a conscious choice. They had absolutely no idea that my firm handled massive acquisitions or that my personal net worth quietly exceeded their combined assets tenfold. I had kept my financial success completely hidden from them, knowing that Brenda would either demand money for her church donations or find a creative way to belittle my accomplishments to protect Jada's fragile ego. The concierge shifted uncomfortably behind the desk, waiting for my reaction. I took a slow, deep breath, letting the heavy silence stretch between us. I did not raise my voice even a fraction. I did not shed a single tear of sorrow. I looked directly into Jada's eyes, stripping away all my previous sisterly affection. Then I shifted my gaze to my father. He finally looked at me, and I saw a fleeting flash of guilt before he cowered and looked down at his shoes. I turned back to the concierge who was watching me with deeply sympathetic eyes. "Thank you for your time and help," I told him politely. "Have a wonderful day." Then I looked at my family one last time. I simply said, "Then I will leave." I turned around and walked purposefully toward the grand glass doors of the luxury resort. I did not look back. I could hear Jada laughing behind me, a sharp and triumphant sound echoing in the cavernous lobby. She genuinely thought she had won. She thought she had finally put me in my rightful place and asserted her dominance. But as I walked out into the bright and blazing Miami sunlight, a profound sense of clarity washed over me. I was not the scared little girl hiding in my childhood bedroom anymore. I was a grown woman who had spent a decade building an impenetrable foundation for my own life. The valet quickly brought my rental car around to the front drive. I tipped him generously and slid into the driver's seat. The leather was cool against my skin. I sat there for a long moment listening to the quiet hum of the engine. My family had fully intended to break my spirit today. They had flown me across the country under the false guise of a unifying family vacation just to leave me stranded and discarded in a hotel lobby. They wanted me to feel utterly worthless. But instead, they had just handed me the key to my own liberation. I had spent 34 years trying to earn a permanent place at their table. I had endured the subtle daily insults, the blatant favoritism, and the emotional coldness because society tells us that family is everything. We are constantly taught to forgive and forget to protect the family image at all costs, especially in our community. But sitting in that car, I finally realized that unwavering loyalty to toxic people is just self-destruction disguised as virtue. I pulled out of the resort driveway, leaving them behind in their bubble of manufactured luxury. They believed they were the elite. They believed Trey was their golden ticket to unlimited wealth and endless social dominance. They believed they had just successfully discarded the weakest link in the family chain. My mind shifted into a cold analytical mode. Bringing me here just to deny me a room was a desperate power play. It was exactly the kind of chaotic move someone makes to cover up a different problem. I pulled over and opened my secure banking application. I scrolled through my recent accounts. There it was. A pending authorization charge for $50,000 at the Azure Grande Resort. Trey had not paid for anything. He had secretly used my corporate black card details to secure the entire booking. He assumed I would just pay it to keep the peace. I immediately clicked the fraud alert button and canceled the card. 2 hours later, my phone lit up. 35 missed calls. The messages from Jada had shifted from arrogant to hysterical. Trey's cards are declining. Security is threatening to throw us out. Where are you? I set the phone face down. They had chosen their path. Now they would just walk it alone. I sat in the plush leather seat of my rental car, letting the cool air conditioning wash over me. The vibrant Miami sun beat down on the windshield, but inside the cabin, everything felt intensely quiet. I had just driven away from the Azure Grande Resort, leaving my family to bask in their manufactured glory. My hands rested steadily on the steering wheel. I felt no urge to cry. I felt no overwhelming wave of depression. Instead, a sharp and crystalline logic took over my mind. I reached into my designer tote bag and pulled out my phone. The entire setup at the lobby had felt too performative even for Jada and Brenda. They had practically shoved the fact that Trey paid for everything down my throat, ensuring every wealthy guest in earshot heard their boast. But people who actually have money do not need to announce it to strangers. I unlocked my screen and opened my secure banking application, navigating straight to my corporate black card account. My thumb hovered over the screen before scrolling down to the pending transactions. There it was, sitting plainly at the top of the list. A pending authorization charge for $50,000 from the Azure Grande Resort. The sheer audacity of it made a cold smile touch my lips. Trey had not paid for a single thing. He had not funded this lavish anniversary trip. He had secretly used my corporate account details to secure the booking for all 5 luxury villas. I leaned back against the headrest, piecing the puzzle together. Brenda must have given him my card information from when I paid for her extravagant birthday gala last year. They had kept my details on file, just waiting for the perfect moment to exploit my financial stability. Trey played the role of the high-rolling real estate mogul in front of the church congregation, but his actual pockets were completely empty. He had used my card for the authorization hold, fully expecting me to do what the dutiful and strong black woman is always conditioned to do. He assumed I would discover the charge panic about the family being embarrassed and simply pay the bill to avoid a massive public scandal. He relied entirely on my silence. He banked on the fact that I would rather swallow a $50,000 debt than watch my father and stepmother get publicly humiliated in a 5-star hotel lobby. For 34 years, that calculation would have been correct. I would have absorbed the cost to protect the fragile facade of black excellence my family so desperately wanted to project. I would have paid for the very vacation they actively excluded me from, just to maintain the illusion of family unity. But that version of Chloe died the moment Jada smirked and told me my miserable energy was not welcome. I pressed the call button for my bank's platinum concierge service. The line rang twice before a crisp and professional voice answered. "Good afternoon, Ms. Williams. How may I assist you today?" I stared out the windshield at the palm trees swaying in the tropical breeze. "I need to report a fraudulent authorization on my account," I said, my voice completely devoid of any emotion. "There is a pending hold for $50,000 from the Azure Grande Resort. I did not authorize this charge and my physical card was not present at the time of booking. I need the card canceled immediately and the authorization permanently revoked." The representative did not hesitate. "I will handle that right away, Ms. Williams. I am issuing a fraud alert, canceling the current card and dropping the pending authorization hold. The resort will be notified immediately that the payment method on file is invalid and declined. Is there anything else I can do for you today?" I thanked him and ended the call. A profound sense of liberation washed over my entire body. With a single phone call, I had removed the safety net my family had secretly woven out of my hard work. The illusion was over. I put the car in drive and pulled away from the curb, heading straight toward South Beach. I had no intention of flying back to Atlanta. I had taken the week off for a vacation and I was going to enjoy it on my own terms. Within 20 minutes, I arrived at a private, ultra-luxury high-rise hotel that prioritized absolute discretion over flashy lobby performances. The staff greeted me by name, taking my bags and escorting me directly to the private elevator. I checked into a stunning penthouse suite featuring floor-to-ceiling windows and a wraparound balcony that offered an unobstructed view of the sparkling Atlantic Ocean. The suite was breathtaking. It was a masterpiece of modern design with white marble floors, plush minimalist furniture, and an expansive master bathroom. I walked into the living area, dropping my keys on the glass table. I ordered a bottle of their most expensive vintage Cabernet Sauvignon from room service. When it arrived, I poured myself a generous glass and stepped out onto the sun-drenched balcony. The warm ocean breeze caught my hair. I took a slow sip of the rich, dark wine, letting the complex flavors settle on my tongue. I looked down at the bustling city below, feeling completely detached from the chaos I knew was currently unfolding a few miles away. I did not feel guilty. I felt like a spectator waiting for a highly anticipated theater performance to reach its climax. I set my phone on the outdoor lounge table facing upward and simply watched the screen. It took exactly 2 hours. At precisely 3 in the afternoon, my phone screen lit up. The caller ID flashed Jada's name. I did not move. I just watched the phone vibrate against the glass table until the call rolled over to voicemail. 10 seconds later, it rang again. This time it was Brenda. Then Jerome. Then Jada again. The screen became a relentless strobe light of incoming calls. The numbers climbed rapidly. 10 missed calls, 20 missed calls, 35 missed calls. The panic radiating through the digital signals was palpable. I picked up the phone and tapped the voicemail icon. I pressed play on the first message. Jada's voice came through the speaker, sounding incredibly annoyed and dripping with entitlement. Chloe, you need to call the bank right now. Trey is at the front desk, and they are saying the hold card declined. Tell them to fix the glitch. We have a spa appointment in 20 minutes, and this is getting ridiculous. I took another sip of my wine. A glitch. That is what Trey was calling it to save face. I swiped to the next voicemail. Brenda's voice was sharp and breathless, laced with mounting hysteria. Chloe, pick up the phone. The manager is out here now. They are asking Trey for another card, and his backups are declining. Do you have any idea how embarrassing this is? Pastor Thomas and his wife are checking in 2 desks down. You need to wire us the money right this second. The audacity was truly breathtaking. Even while facing public humiliation, Brenda still demanded my compliance. I played the final voicemail. It was Jada again, but the arrogant tone had completely vanished. She was sobbing uncontrollably, her voice cracking with sheer terror and humiliation. Chloe, please answer the phone. The security guards are standing right next to us. They told Dad we have to vacate the lobby immediately because Trey cannot cover the deposit. Everyone is staring at us. They are treating us like criminals. Dad is hyperventilating and Trey is arguing with the manager. Please, you have to bring your card. Please do not leave us here like this. I listened to her weeping, listening to the background noise of the resort manager firmly asking Trey to lower his voice. The same luxurious lobby where they had proudly discarded me just 2 hours ago was now the exact stage of their ultimate disgrace. They had tried to banish me so they could play the roles of the wealthy elite. Now they were being escorted off the premises like common trespassers stripped of their fake prestige in front of the very people they desperately wanted to impress. They had no money. They had no backup plan. They had nothing but the lies they told each other. I looked out at the vast blue ocean, taking a final slow breath of the salty air. I opened my phone settings and toggled the Do Not Disturb feature. The screen went dark, cutting off their access to me completely. I placed the phone back on the table, picked up my wine glass, and finally let myself enjoy my vacation. I would later learn the exact details of their spectacular exit from Miami through a combination of frantic texts sent by Jada to my blocked number and the detailed incident report I quietly requested from the resort management. The scene unfolded exactly as I had predicted. The resort security team, composed of 2 broad-shouldered men in crisp dark suits, flanked my family as they were marched across the expansive marble lobby. Brenda tried desperately to hide her face behind her oversized designer sunglasses and wide-brimmed sun hat, but it was completely useless. Pastor Thomas and his wife, standing at the VIP check-in counter, watched the entire spectacle with wide, unblinking eyes. Jerome walked with his head bowed, his posture completely defeated, while Jada openly sobbed, clutching her luxury beach bag like a life preserver. Trey, the supposed self-made millionaire, was sweating profusely in his custom linen suit. He spent the entire agonizing walk shouting into his cell phone, pretending to yell at his wealth manager about a frozen wire transfer. Nobody believed him. The resort staff had seen this exact type of fraud 100 times before. The ultimate humiliation occurred when they reached the blazing hot parking lot. Trey's leased luxury sports car simply did not have enough trunk space to accommodate the massive mountain of luggage they had brought for their 5-star vacation. Under the watchful eyes of the resort security, they were forced to unpack their bags on the concrete pavement, shoving their expensive clothes and designer shoes into plastic grocery bags they found in the trunk just to make everything fit. Driven out of the exclusive enclave of South Beach, they had to navigate toward the gritty outskirts of the city. With all of their credit cards declining, they were forced to pool whatever cash they had on hand to secure a room at a dilapidated roadside motel located right next to the roaring interstate highway. Instead of dining on caviar and imported champagne, They spent their highly anticipated anniversary night eating stale vending machine snacks while listening to the neon motel sign buzzing violently outside their single shared room window. The kingdom of lies they had built collapsed into a cheap motel room smelling heavily of bleach and old cigarette smoke. A week later, we were all back in Atlanta. I had returned to my beautiful high-rise condo, feeling completely refreshed and recharged from my solo vacation. But Brenda could never let a defeat go unanswered. If she could not control me financially, she would try to destroy me socially. She immediately launched a calculated and vicious smear campaign within our highly affluent church community. The Greater Zion Fellowship was the absolute epicenter of social status for wealthy Black families in Atlanta, and Brenda treated the church's private Facebook group like her own personal broadcasting network. Sitting at my kitchen island with a fresh cup of espresso, I opened the app and watched her masterclass in manipulation unfold. She posted a lengthy emotional paragraph completely rewriting the events of Miami. She cast herself as the heartbroken and loving matriarch who just wanted to bring her blended family together. According to her deeply twisted narrative, I had maliciously canceled the hotel rooms at the very last minute out of pure spite and jealousy. She weaponized my single status, portraying me as a bitter and hardened career woman who simply could not stand to see her younger sister happily married to a successful Black man. "I ask for your prayers, congregation," she wrote, adding a praying hands emoji. My oldest daughter is lost in her anger. It breaks my heart to see her so jealous of the beautiful generational wealth Trey and Jada are building. We are praying that God softens her bitter heart and shows her that a woman is nothing without her family. The comments section was a predictable echo chamber of toxic validation. The church aunties and the wealthy deacons' wives flooded the post with misguided sympathy. They quoted scriptures about forgiveness and honoring thy mother and father. They praised Trey for being an outstanding example of Black excellence and lamented how modern independent women like me were destroying the fabric of the traditional family. They bought into the exact narrative Brenda was selling, hook, line, and sinker. They believed I was the villain because an unmarried, successful woman who refuses to finance her family's delusions is always viewed as the enemy. I read through every single comment without feeling a shred of guilt. Their empty prayers and misplaced judgment meant absolutely nothing to me. I simply took a screenshot of the post, sent it to my secure digital archive, and continued drinking my coffee. Let them pray for my soul. They would need those prayers for themselves very soon. Despite the digital warfare, I had an unavoidable obligation to attend a Sunday family dinner later that week. The dinner was not hosted at Brenda's house, but at the home of my Aunt Denise. Denise was Jerome's older sister, and she was the only person in our entire bloodline who possessed an ounce of common sense. She was a retired judge, a woman of impeccable character, and the only relative who had ever truly supported my educational and professional pursuits. I knew Brenda and Jada would be there, but I refused to let them think they had intimidated me into hiding. I dressed in a sharp-tailored pantsuit, slipped on my favorite diamond stud earrings, and drove to Denise's elegant brick home in the historic Cascade neighborhood. The moment I walked through the front door, the atmosphere instantly thickened. The rich scent of roasted chicken and collard greens filled the air, but the tension in the dining room was thick enough to cut with a knife. Brenda sat at the head of the long dining table, glaring at me over her crystal water goblet. Jada refused to make eye contact, aggressively cutting her food, while Trey puffed out his chest, attempting to look intimidating. Jerome stared down at his plate, looking exactly like the coward he was. I greeted everyone with a polite and unbothered smile, refusing to give them the reaction they desperately craved. I took my seat and engaged in light conversation with my younger cousins, acting as if the catastrophic events in Miami had never even happened. After dinner concluded, Aunt Denise quietly touched my shoulder. "Chloe, come help me with the dessert dishes in the kitchen," she requested. Her tone was casual, but her eyes conveyed a distinct sense of urgency. I picked up a stack of plates and followed her through the swinging wooden doors. The moment the doors closed behind us, cutting off the chatter from the dining room, Denise's entire demeanor shifted. She set the plates down on the granite counter and turned to face me, crossing her arms over her chest. Her sharp, analytical eyes locked onto mine. You played a dangerous game in Miami. Chloe, she said, her voice low and serious. I just protected my assets, Aunt Denise, I replied smoothly. He tried to steal $50,000 from me. I simply stopped the transaction. Denise let out a heavy sigh, shaking her head. I am not scolding you, baby. You did exactly what you had to do. I am warning you. She stepped closer, lowering her voice even further so the sound would not carry past the kitchen walls. You need to distance yourself from Trey immediately. Do not lend them money. Do not sign anything. Do not let your father convince you to co-sign any loans. Trey is not who he claims to be. I leaned against the counter, my interest fully piqued. I always knew he was a fraud, Aunt Denise. His clothes are leased and his watch is fake. But you sound like you know something specific. I still have friends working in the district attorney's office, Denise explained carefully. Trey's highly publicized real estate investment fund is nothing but smoke and mirrors. He has not acquired a single legitimate commercial property in over 2 years. His entire business model is a facade. He has been targeting elderly church members and vulnerable retirees, convincing them to invest their life savings into his phantom developments. He promises them guaranteed returns, but he is just using the new investor money to pay off the old investors. And worse, he is using a massive chunk of that capital to fund his own lavish lifestyle and keep Jada dripping in designer labels. A cold chill ran down my spine as her words clicked into place. A Ponzi scheme. He is running a literal Ponzi scheme right inside the church congregation. Denise nodded grimly. Exactly. But the walls are closing in on him. The payouts to his early investors have stopped. People are starting to ask loud questions. I heard through the grapevine that he recently approached the church elders begging for a massive bridge loan to cover his immediate debts. He claimed it was a temporary cash flow issue, but the elders denied him. He is drowning Chloe. The Miami trip was supposed to be a networking event where he planned to secure new victims. When you cut off his funding, you humiliated him, but you also triggered a massive panic. He has violent creditors breathing down his neck right now. I absorbed this information rapidly, my mind racing through the financial implications. If Trey was running a failing Ponzi scheme, he would be desperate for massive amounts of untraceable capital. A man that desperate would bleed his own family dry just to stay out of a federal prison cell. He would manipulate Jada, and he would absolutely manipulate my father. I looked at Aunt Denise, feeling a surge of genuine gratitude. Why are you telling this to me and not to Jerome? I asked. Denise let out a bitter laugh. I tried to warn your father 3 months ago. I told him to hire an independent auditor to look at Trey's books. Jerome refused. He accused me of being jealous of his successful son-in-law. He is so blinded by his desire for prestige and so terrified of Brenda's temper that he will march right off a cliff just to maintain the illusion of success. Jerome has made his bed, and now he is going to have to lie in it. Denise grabbed my hands, squeezing them tightly. I am telling you because you actually have something to lose. You have built a beautiful life for yourself. You have real wealth and a flawless professional reputation. When Trey's house of cards finally collapses, the fallout is going to be spectacular, and it is going to be incredibly destructive. The federal authorities will eventually get involved. They will seize assets. They will freeze bank accounts. They will drag everyone associated with him down into the mud. You must protect yourself, Chloe. Build a fortress around your finances and do not let them guilt you into opening the gates. I looked into my aunt's eyes, seeing the fierce protective love that my own father had never possessed. I squeezed her hands back, feeling a newfound sense of clarity. You do not need to worry about me, Aunt Denise. I told her, my voice steady and resolute. I saw through their charade a long time ago. I have already secured my boarders. Let them enjoy their fancy dinners and their fake accomplishments. When the crash comes, I will be standing safely on the other side of the impact zone. Denise smiled, a proud and genuine expression. Good girl. Now grab that tray of peach cobbler. We have to go back out there and smile at the devil. We returned to the dining room, and I served the peach cobbler with a flawless and pleasant smile. Brenda glared at me but remained entirely silent, while Jada aggressively scrolled through her phone, avoiding my gaze completely. Jerome kept his head down, focusing intensely on his dessert, as if the baked fruit held the answers to the universe. I finished my portion, thanked Aunt Denise for her wonderful hospitality, and walked out the front door with my head held high. I felt a profound sense of clarity as I drove my sleek corporate sedan back to my penthouse. The battle lines were officially drawn and the enemy was rapidly running out of ammunition. The next evening, I was sitting in my home office reviewing quarterly financial projections for a major corporate client. The floor-to-ceiling windows of my high-rise condo offered a sweeping and spectacular view of the illuminated Atlanta skyline. It was a visual reminder of the empire I had quietly built with my own hands. My phone vibrated on the glass desk. The caller identification displayed Jerome's name. I watched the screen glow for a few seconds, letting the device vibrate. My father rarely called me directly. He usually communicated his demands through Brenda or simply relied on family group chats to issue his patriarchal decrees. Calling me on a Monday night meant he had been dispatched by Brenda to handle the situation and bring the rebellious daughter back into submission. I took a sip of sparkling water, cleared my throat, and answered the call. "Good evening, Dad," I said, keeping my voice perfectly even and professional. "Chloe, we need to have a serious conversation," Jerome began. He used his deep and resonant church voice, the specific tone he always employed when he wanted to sound like a disappointed but loving patriarch. He did not sound angry. He sounded exhausted and deeply let down, which was a calculated psychological tactic he had used on me since I was a teenager. "I am very hurt by your behavior, Chloe. Your mother is hurt. Jada is completely devastated. I do not understand why you are actively trying to tear this family apart." I leaned back in my ergonomic leather chair. "I am not tearing anything apart, Dad. I simply declined to finance a $50,000 vacation that I was explicitly excluded from." Jerome let out a heavy and dramatic sigh. "You are blowing everything entirely out of proportion. Trey is managing millions of dollars in real estate assets. His primary corporate account simply flagged the massive resort charge as potential fraud and froze his card. It was just a banking glitch. It happens to high net worth individuals all the time. You are the older sister, Chloe. You have a good corporate job and you make good money. You knew Trey was good for it. Why would you embarrass us like that in front of all those wealthy white folks and the people from our church? You made us look like we do not belong there." I listened to his words, processing the sheer depth of his delusion. He was genuinely prioritizing the opinions of absolute strangers in a Miami lobby over the financial and emotional well-being of his own daughter. "A strong black family protects its own. Chloe." Jerome continued, his voice taking on a preaching cadence. "We lift each other up. We do not abandon our family members in a strange city just to prove a petty point. Trey is working night and day to build a legacy for our name. He is carrying the weight of generational wealth on his shoulders. You should have stepped up and covered the hold. We would have paid you back the very next morning. Instead, you chose jealousy. You chose bitterness. You let your pride humiliate your own blood." The manipulation was textbook. He was weaponizing racial solidarity, family loyalty, and my supposed bitterness all in one breath. He wanted me to feel a crushing sense of guilt for protecting my own bank account. For 34 years, that speech would have worked. It would have made me question my own sanity and apologize for being difficult. But Aunt Denise's warning echoed loudly in my mind. Jerome was marching straight off a cliff and he was angry that I refused to jump with him. I let his heavy silence hang on the line for a long moment before I finally spoke. My voice was completely devoid of emotion, matching the cold and calculated reality of the situation. "There was no banking glitch, Dad," I said, speaking slowly and deliberately so he could hear every single syllable. "A banking glitch might freeze one card. It does not decline 5 different backup credit cards. A millionaire with a frozen account calls his wealth manager to wire funds directly to the resort. He does not force his father-in-law to empty his pockets for a roadside motel." Jerome bristled instantly, his tone shifting from disappointed to defensive. You do not understand how corporate finance works, Chloe. Trey has all his capital tied up in massive development projects. His cash flow is restricted right now because he is acquiring new commercial lots. I actually understand corporate finance better than anyone in this family, Dad, I countered sharply. It is literally my profession to audit failing businesses. And Trey's business is a complete fantasy. What are you talking about? Jerome demanded, his voice rising. I am talking about the blatant lies you are choosing to believe, I said. You want to talk about Trey's wealth? Let's talk about his custom Audemars Piguet watch, the one he flashed all over the dinner table last Thanksgiving. Real luxury automatic watches sweep continuously. Trey's watch has a ticking second hand. It is a cheap knockoff from a street vendor. Let us talk about his fleet of luxury sports cars. Every single one of them has a license plate frame from a short-term corporate leasing agency. He does not own those vehicles. He rents them by the month to maintain his image. He is not building generational wealth, Dad. He is building a theatrical production, and he is using our family as the stage. How dare you, Jerome shouted, losing his carefully constructed patriarchal composure. The truth was too painful for him to hear, so he immediately attacked the messenger. You have always been like this, Chloe. Always looking down your nose at people who have the entrepreneurial courage that you completely lack. You sit in your sterile corporate cubicle and judge a black man who is out there actually making moves. I am not judging him for making moves, Dad. I am judging him for making them with stolen money and lies, I fired back, refusing to back down. Jerome scoffed loudly into the phone. You are just bitter. You are a bitter and jealous woman. You cannot stand the fact that your younger sister found a highly successful man who treats her like a queen while you sit alone in your empty apartment. You think you are so much smarter than everyone else in this family, but your arrogance is going to leave you completely isolated. No man wants a woman who constantly tries to emasculate him and tear down his achievements. You are going to die alone with your bank account because you do not know how to be a part of a real family. His words were designed to inflict maximum psychological damage. He was using every toxic stereotype about independent single women to break my confidence. But instead of feeling pain, I only felt a profound and overwhelming sense of pity for the man on the other end of the line. If being part of this family means letting a con artist drain my bank account to fund his leased lifestyle, then I am perfectly happy being alone. I said, my voice dropping to a terrifyingly calm register. You have made your choice, Dad. You have chosen Brenda's illusions and Trey's lies over your own daughter's protection. Do not call me again to fix the messes he creates. You do not ever have to worry about that. Jerome spat viciously. We do not need your money, and we certainly do not need your toxic energy. Consider yourself completely cut off from this family. The line went dead with a sharp click. Jerome had hung up on me. I slowly lowered the phone from my ear and set it down on the glass desk. The silence in my penthouse felt incredibly heavy, but it was not oppressive. It was deeply peaceful. I stood up and walked over to the massive floor-to-ceiling windows looking out over the sprawling city of Atlanta below. The headlights of thousands of cars moved along the interstate like tiny rivers of light. Jerome's final words echoed in my mind. Consider yourself completely cut off. He thought he was punishing me. He thought the threat of losing my family would send me into a spiral of despair and submission. He genuinely believed that his approval was the most valuable currency in my life. But as I stared out at the city, I realized a fundamental truth that shifted the entire trajectory of my existence. Blood means absolutely nothing when it is permanently tied to delusion. My father did not love me. He loved the utility I provided, and he loved the submission he demanded. The moment I stopped providing utility and refused to submit, I became completely disposable to him. He was willing to sacrifice his own flesh and blood to protect the ego of a man who was actively leading him straight to the slaughterhouse. Aunt Denise was right. Trey was drowning, and he was going to drag Jerome and Brenda down into the deep end with him. My father had just explicitly chosen his side. He had locked the doors to his own burning house and demanded that I stay outside. I felt no urge to break a window and save him anymore. I walked over to my polished mahogany credenza and poured myself a glass of chilled, sparkling water. My mind was no longer clouded by the heavy burden of daughterly obligation or the desperate desire for parental validation. The emotional ties that had chained me to their toxic ecosystem were completely severed. I walked back to my desk and woke up my computer monitors. I opened a secure encrypted folder on my desktop labeled Restructuring Profiles. I created a brand new subfolder and typed a single name into the title bar. The name of Trey's supposedly massive real estate investment firm. If my family wanted to play the game of corporate wealth and elite finance, I was going to show them exactly how the real game was played. They wanted to pretend they were the untouchable elite sitting on thrones of generational wealth. I was going to audit their entire kingdom. I began running background checks, pulling public property records, and initiating deep corporate entity searches. I was no longer the scapegoat daughter seeking a seat at their table. I was the financial Grim Reaper, and I was about to meticulously dismantle their entire illusion brick by brick. I plunged into the digital labyrinth of Fulton County public property records the very next morning. The sun had barely crested the horizon, but my screens were already glowing with spreadsheets, corporate filings, and cross-referenced tax documents. As a corporate restructuring consultant, my daily routine involved auditing distressed assets and unraveling complex webs of financial mismanagement. I applied those exact same forensic skills to Trey and his supposedly booming enterprise. I started by tracing the registration of his primary limited liability company. It was registered to a virtual mail drop in a strip mall confirming Aunt Denise's intel that he had no actual physical office space. But as I ran a routine audit on the local commercial property sector, attempting to cross-reference any actual assets tied to his name, a familiar address flashed across my second monitor. I leaned closer to the screen, my heart skipping a steady beat. The address belonged to a highly profitable retail strip center in Midtown Atlanta. It was a property that my biological mother had purchased with Jerome over 30 years ago, long before Brenda ever entered the picture. My mother had possessed the sharp business acumen that Jerome always lacked. When she tragically passed away, her will explicitly stated that her 50% equity in that specific property, along with 2 other prime commercial lots in Decatur, was to be held securely and eventually transferred to me. Those 3 properties were my true inheritance. They were the tangible legacy my mother had bled to build for my future. My fingers flew across the keyboard, pulling up the official deed history for all 3 locations. The digital document loaded onto my screen, and the breath was instantly knocked out of my lungs. A profound and chilling silence filled my office. The deeds no longer bore Jerome's name alongside my mother's trust. According to the time-stamped legal filings processed just 4 months ago, Jerome had executed a quitclaim deed. He had quietly and illegally transferred the full ownership of all 3 commercial properties directly into Trey's primary business holding account. I stared at the glowing white screen, feeling a wave of absolute nausea wash over me. The transfer document listed the transaction as collateral for an investment partnership. My father had not just defended a con artist. He had actually handed over the very foundation of my biological mother's legacy to fund a complete fraud. He had stolen my rightful inheritance, the equity that legally and morally belonged to me, just to play the role of the wealthy benefactor for his new son-in-law. The sheer magnitude of the betrayal paralyzed me for a long moment. Jerome knew exactly what those properties meant to me. He knew they were the last remaining connection I had to the woman who gave me life. And he had signed them away with a stroke of a pen completely behind my back, just to keep Brenda and Jada happy. I pulled up the exact terms of the collateral transfer. Trey had leveraged the 3 commercial lots to secure a massive commercial loan from a secondary predatory lending institution. He had mortgaged my mother's legacy to the absolute hilt, pulling out millions in cash equity. The properties were now drowning in toxic debt, and if Trey defaulted, which I already knew he was currently doing, the bank would seize all of them. The legacy my mother built would be auctioned off on the courthouse steps to pay for Trey's leased sports cars and fake luxury watches. My father had actively participated in the financial assassination of his own daughter. I clicked through the subsequent property tax records and loan origination documents, verifying every single signature and notary stamp. There was no mistake. Jerome had knowingly and willingly liquidated my future to finance his current delusion. The deep-seated anger that had been simmering inside me since Miami suddenly crystallized into something entirely different. It was no longer a burning rage. It was absolute sub-zero ice. The man who had called me bitter and jealous just the night before had been standing on a mountain of my stolen wealth while he delivered his self-righteous sermon. He had told me a strong black family protects its own, while he was actively picking my pockets in the dark. I needed to understand the exact catalyst for this massive financial suicide mission. Jerome was a coward, but he was usually a highly risk-averse coward. He would never jeopardize his primary income streams unless he was pushed into a corner by a force much stronger than his own sense of self-preservation. And in my family, there was only one force powerful enough to drive Jerome to commit felony-level financial fraud: Brenda. I opened a new search window and began scouring Brenda's recent digital footprint. Her social media was a heavily curated exhibit of her desperate climb up the Atlanta social ladder. I bypassed the church event photos and zeroed in on her posts from exactly 4 months ago, the exact same timeline when the property deeds were illegally transferred to Trey. The digital breadcrumbs led me straight to the truth. Brenda had posted a series of highly produced videos touring a sprawling $10 million new construction mansion in the ultra-exclusive Buckhead neighborhood. The captions were dripping with arrogant entitlement. Claiming our new territory. God is elevating our territory. Generational wealth moves in silence but lives out loud. The pieces of the puzzle slammed together with sickening clarity. Brenda had grown tired of their comfortable but modest suburban home. She wanted a mega mansion to compete with the wealthiest wives in the church congregation. But Jerome's retail business could never support a $10 million mortgage. So Brenda orchestrated the ultimate familial heist. She pressured Jerome to transfer the commercial properties to Trey, believing his aggressive and flashy real estate pitches. Trey had promised them that if they used the properties as collateral for his elite crypto and real estate investment fund, he would triple their equity in 6 months and buy the Buckhead mansion for them in straight cash. It was a lethal combination of unchecked greed and spectacular ignorance. Brenda wanted the crown of the ultimate society matriarch, and Trey needed a massive influx of cash to keep his Ponzi scheme from collapsing. Jerome, the perpetual peacekeeper, had simply offered up my mother's hard-earned legacy as the sacrificial lamb to satisfy both of them. They had gambled my entire inheritance on a fake crypto portfolio that did not even exist outside of Trey's fabricated pitch decks. I sat back in my chair, the silence of my penthouse suite pressing against my ears. They had not just excluded me from a vacation. They had actively conspired to rob me blind while smiling in my face. The absolute sheer disrespect of it all demanded a response that went far beyond cutting off contact. Ignoring them was no longer an option. I needed to look them directly in their eyes and watch the exact moment they realized their financial executioner was the daughter they had discarded. I reached out and pressed the power button on my high-capacity laser printer. The machine hummed to life, a low and steady mechanical growl that sounded like the drawing of a sword. I selected the deed transfer records, the predatory loan agreements, the fake LLC registrations, and the property foreclosure warning notices. I hit print. The pages began sliding into the output tray one by one. The rhythmic sound of the printing process felt like a countdown clock ticking away the final moments of my family's fabricated empire. With every sheet of paper that landed in the tray, my heart grew colder. I was methodically organizing the exact instruments of their destruction. I gathered the warm, freshly printed documents and aligned their edges with sharp precision. I placed the massive stack of undeniable evidence into a sleek black leather portfolio, snapping the magnetic closure shut. The portfolio felt heavy in my hands, carrying the weight of my biological mother's stolen legacy and the absolute definitive proof of my father's treason. I stood up from my desk and walked over to the hallway mirror. I smoothed down the lapels of my tailored blazer, checking my reflection. My posture was perfectly straight. My expression was completely unreadable. I was not walking into their house as Chloe, the unwanted daughter who constantly sought their validation. I was walking through their front door as the leading forensic auditor of my firm, fully prepared to issue a terminal financial diagnosis. I grabbed my car keys and headed for the private elevator. It was time to pay a visit to the architects of my ruin and hand them the invoice for their greed. The drive to the suburbs was a quiet blur of streetlights and shifting shadows. I pulled up to the sprawling colonial house where I had spent my teenage years feeling like an unwanted guest. The driveway was packed with vehicles, including Trey's leased luxury sports car parked brazenly right across the front walkway. I parked my sedan on the street, grabbed my black leather portfolio, and walked up the pristine brick path. I did not bother knocking. I used my old house key and pushed the heavy mahogany front door open. The sound of clinking wine glasses and loud, arrogant laughter drifted from the formal living room. I walked in and found the entire cast of characters assembled perfectly. Jerome was sitting in his favorite leather armchair, swirling amber liquid in a crystal tumbler. Brenda was perched on the edge of the plush velvet sofa, holding court. Jada and Trey were lounging opposite her, looking completely unbothered by the fact that they had been chased out of Miami by hotel security just days prior. They were drinking expensive red wine and acting as if they were sitting on top of the world. The laughter abruptly died the moment I stepped into the room. 4 pairs of eyes snapped toward me, registering shock and immediate defensiveness. "What are you doing here?" Jerome demanded, setting his tumbler down on the side table with a sharp clink. "I told you we had nothing left to discuss." I ignored his posturing. I walked directly to the center of the room and dropped the heavy black leather portfolio onto the glass coffee table. The resulting smack echoed loudly in the tense air. "I am here to talk about the Decatur commercial lots and the Midtown Retail Center," I said, keeping my voice deadly calm. "I am here to talk about the fact that you illegally transferred 50% of my biological mother's legacy into a phantom limited liability company controlled by a con artist." Jerome's face instantly drained of color. He looked wildly at Brenda, his default panic response. Brenda simply tightened her grip on her wine glass, her jaw locking into a rigid line. Trey shifted uncomfortably on the sofa, pulling at the collar of his designer shirt, but he remained completely silent. He knew exactly what was inside that portfolio. Jada, however, possessed the spectacular ignorance required to speak up. She rolled her eyes and let out a loud, theatrical sigh. She stood up, crossing her arms over her chest and glaring at me with absolute contempt. "Dad is just investing in his son-in-law," Jada said, her voice dripping with insufferable arrogance. "Trey is going to make us tens of millions of dollars with these assets. You are just a corporate drone. You sit in a cubicle all day auditing spreadsheets. You do not understand elite wealth building or how real leverage works." I looked at my younger sister, feeling a strange mix of pity and absolute disgust. "Elite wealth building," I repeated flatly. "Jada, your husband is currently 120 days past due on the secondary predatory loans he took out against those properties. The banks are preparing to foreclose on everything. He is not building wealth. He is using Dad's assets to pay off aggressive loan sharks because his entire real estate fund is a massive Ponzi scheme." "That is a complete lie," Trey finally barked, standing up to tower over me. He pointed a shaking finger in my direction. "You are manipulating public records because you cannot handle the fact that I am elevating this family to the next tax bracket. My cash flow is temporarily restricted due to heavy acquisitions. It is standard high-level commerce." I did not even blink. "Standard high-level commerce does not involve transferring stolen family equity to a shell company registered to a strip mall mailbox," I countered smoothly. I turned back to my father, who was now sweating profusely. "Dad, you committed federal fraud. You signed away properties that were legally bound to my mother's trust. When those properties are seized and auctioned off, you will have absolutely nothing left. Not a single dime." Jerome opened his mouth to speak, but his voice completely failed him. He looked like a trapped animal desperately searching for an exit. He knew I had the receipts. He knew I had caught him red-handed in the ultimate betrayal. He looked at Trey, hoping the fake mogul would produce a miraculous defense, but Trey was busy glaring at the floor, avoiding eye contact with everyone. "You had no right to snoop through my private financial filings," Jerome finally stammered, his voice shaking with cowardice. "I am the patriarch of this family. I make the financial decisions that ensure our survival. Those properties were stagnating. Trey offered a massive return on investment. I did what I had to do to protect our future. You did what Brenda told you to do so she could buy a $10 million mansion in Buckhead, I corrected him sharply. You liquidated my mother's life work to buy your wife a shiny new toy to brag about at church. That was the exact trigger Brenda needed. She slammed her wine glass down on the table with such force, the crystal stem nearly shattered. She stood up, her eyes blazing with raw, unchecked fury. She stepped directly into my personal space, trying to use her physical presence to intimidate me just as she had done when I was a child. How dare you come into my home and disrespect my husband, she hissed, her face contorted with rage. You have always been a problem, Chloe. Always so bitter, always so selfish. Your mother left those properties to the family, and we are the family. We are putting those assets to work for the greater good of the Blackwell name. You have hoarded your corporate salary for years, refusing to contribute to our elevation. So we took what was necessary to secure our rightful place in society. I stared at her, refusing to give up even an inch of ground. You stole my inheritance, Brenda. That is grand larceny. Brenda let out a sharp, cruel laugh. Prove it. Prove that Jerome did not have the legal right to restructure family assets as the primary trustee. You cannot. Because you are nothing but an angry, lonely woman trying to drag everyone else down into your miserable reality. She pointed a manicured finger directly at my face, delivering the final, fatal blow. You have no say here. Everything goes to Trey and Jada now. You are cut off. Figure your own life out. Do not ever come back to this house again. The silence that followed her declaration was absolute and profound. Jerome looked away, staring at the fireplace. Jada smirked, leaning her head on Trey's shoulder, clearly thrilled that I had just been officially banished from the kingdom. They expected me to break. They expected me to scream, cry, or beg for my rightful share of the estate. They wanted the satisfaction of watching the independent and successful daughter crumble under the weight of their ultimate rejection. But I did not shed a single tear. I did not raise my voice. The burning anger that had propelled me to this house completely evaporated, leaving behind a perfectly clear and frictionless void. Brenda had just handed me the greatest gift I could have ever asked for. By explicitly claiming that everything went to Trey and Jada and officially cutting me off, she had severed the very last thread of moral obligation I possessed toward them. They were no longer my family making bad decisions. They were simply hostile financial actors actively conspiring to defraud me. I looked at Jerome, giving him one final chance to speak up, to defend his daughter, to salvage a shred of his dignity. Dad, I said quietly, is this really how you want to play this? Jerome swallowed hard, his Adam's apple bobbing nervously. He refused to meet my gaze. Your mother has spoken, Chloe. You need to leave. I nodded slowly, processing the finality of his cowardice. I reached down to the glass coffee table and picked up my black leather portfolio. I did not leave the printed documents for them to review. They did not deserve the courtesy of an advance warning. I tucked the portfolio securely under my arm. I understand completely, I said, my voice smooth and perfectly calm. You have made yourselves very clear. I will not bother you anymore. I wish you all the best of luck with your elite wealth building. I turned my back on them and walked toward the front door. Jada's triumphant laughter echoed through the foyer as I stepped out into the cool night air. I pulled the heavy mahogany door shut behind me, listening to the solid click of the lock engaging. I walked down the pristine brick path and got into my car, tossing the portfolio onto the passenger seat. As I started the engine, I looked at the house one last time. They had no idea what they had just done. By cutting me off and throwing their lot in with Trey's fraudulent empire, they had voluntarily boarded a sinking ship and locked themselves in the cargo hold. They thought they had secured millions of dollars and a guaranteed ticket to the upper echelons of Atlanta society. They thought they had permanently defeated the annoying daughter who always asked too many questions. They did not realize they had just signed their own death warrant. Trey was drowning in toxic debt from ruthless creditors. The bank was already drawing up the foreclosure paperwork for the commercial properties and the very house they were sitting in. And worst of all, they had completely alienated the only person who possessed the financial capital and the professional expertise to actually save them from the impending collapse. I put the car in drive and pulled away from the curb, leaving the sprawling suburban house in my rearview mirror. I felt an incredible sense of lightness spreading through my chest. The toxic burden of trying to save them, trying to warn them, trying to earn their respect was entirely gone. I was no longer bound by the rules of their dysfunctional game. I pulled my phone from my pocket and dialed Elias, my law partner, and the sharpest commercial litigation attorney in the state. He answered on the second ring despite the late hour. "Chloe," he said, his voice alert. "Did you talk to them?" "I did," I replied, merging onto the highway heading back toward the city. "It is exactly as we suspected. Jerome transferred the deeds to Trey to fund a Ponzi scheme, and Brenda just officially disowned me to protect the illusion. They are fully committed to the fraud." Elias let out a low whistle over the line. "So what is the play? Do we call the authorities and report the fraudulent transfer?" I smiled, staring at the empty road ahead of me. "No," I said, my tone dropping into pure corporate strategy mode. "If we report the fraud now, the properties get tied up in federal litigation for years. We need to move faster than the government, and we need to move faster than Trey's creditors. We are going to let them keep digging their own graves. I want you to pull every single file on the bank holding Trey's defaulted commercial loans." Elias chuckled, understanding my strategy immediately. "You want to buy the debt? I want to buy all of it," I confirmed. "I want to buy the commercial loans, I want to buy the mortgage on Jerome's house, and I want to buy every single promissory note Trey has signed in the last 12 months. If my family wants to cut me off and give everything to Trey, that is perfectly fine. I am going to make sure they do exactly that. And then I am going to take it all back from him." The morning after I walked out of my father's house, I was seated in the sleek minimalist conference room of my firm's legal partner, Elias. He was already waiting for me, 2 cups of black coffee steaming on the polished glass table. Elias was a legal shark, a man whose ability to dissect complex financial fraud was only matched by his impeccably tailored suits. I dropped the leather portfolio onto the table and took a seat across from him. I laid it all out. The unauthorized transfer of the commercial deeds the Phantom LLC registered to a strip mall, and the massive secondary loans secured against my biological mother's legacy. Elias listened intently, his expression shifting from professional curiosity to predatory focus. We did not waste time with pleasantries. We plunged directly into the financial underbelly of Trey's supposed real estate empire. Elias pulled up his advanced proprietary databases, the kind of investigative software that cuts through corporate veils and exposes the true owners of shadow companies. We started by mapping the flow of capital from the secondary predatory loans Trey had secured using Jerome's commercial properties as collateral. The initial loan amount was staggering, far exceeding the actual market value of the assets, indicating that Trey had likely falsified appraisals or bribed a corrupt loan officer to secure the funding. But what was truly horrifying was how rapidly that massive injection of cash had simply vanished. Elias's fingers flew across his keyboard, tracing the digital transactions. He didn't acquire any new commercial lots. "Chloe," Elias said, his voice dropping into a low, clinical register. "Look at this. The capital from your father's properties was immediately dispersed into 30 different shell accounts within 48 hours of the loan origination. This isn't a real estate acquisition strategy. This is a deliberate and frantic attempt to obfuscate the money trail." We spent the next 3 hours painstakingly reconstructing that fractured money trail piece by digital piece. The picture that emerged was not just a failing business. It was a textbook catastrophic Ponzi scheme on the verge of a spectacular implosion. Trey had spent the last 2 years soliciting massive investments from vulnerable members of the Greater Zion Fellowship congregation, promising them guaranteed double-digit returns on fictitious commercial developments. For a while, he had managed to sustain the illusion by paying out early investors with the capital he raised from newer victims. But as the pool of willing investors dried up, the scheme began to devour itself. The massive loan he had secured against Jerome's properties was a desperate last-ditch effort to plug the gaping holes in his sinking ship. But even that massive influx of capital wasn't enough to save him. He was bleeding money faster than he could steal it. Elias pulled up the payment history for the secondary loan secured by the commercial properties. "It's worse than we thought," he said, pointing to the screen. "He hasn't made a single payment on this loan in over 4 months. He is 120 days past due. The grace period has completely expired, and the default clauses have been triggered. The bank is legally preparing to initiate foreclosure proceedings. They are going to seize all 3 properties, Chloe. And based on these cross-collateralization clauses, they are going to seize your father's primary residence as well. They are going to take everything." The gravity of the situation was immense, but I felt a strange sense of detachment. Jerome had willingly handed the keys to the castle to a con artist, and now the kingdom was about to be burned to the ground. But what truly sealed Trey's fate was discovering exactly where the rest of the stolen capital had gone. He wasn't just using the money to pay off early investors or appease aggressive creditors. He was actively financing an absurdly extravagant lifestyle completely separate from Jada and the family. Elias accessed a series of offshore credit card statements linked to one of Trey's hidden shell accounts. The charges were blatant and reckless. "We found hundreds of thousands of dollars in wire transfers to an account registered in Miami." "Who is the beneficiary of this account?" I asked, leaning closer to the monitor. Elias ran the name through his database. "It's a luxury condominium lease in South Beach," Elias confirmed, pulling up a secondary document. "And look at these credit card charges. Diamond necklaces, custom sports cars, chartered yacht rentals, and massive monthly cash allowances." Trey wasn't just running a Ponzi scheme. He was using my family's stolen wealth to finance a high-end mistress in Miami, the very same city where he had attempted to use my corporate card to fund his anniversary trip with Jada, because he had already drained his actual accounts dry buying gifts for his girlfriend. The pieces connected with devastating clarity. Trey was completely cornered. The loan sharks he had borrowed from, to keep the early investors quiet, were demanding their money. The bank was preparing to foreclose on the commercial properties and Jerome's house. The congregation was beginning to ask questions about their missing dividends. And through it all, he was still hemorrhaging cash to maintain a secret double life in Florida. He was a dead man walking, and he had tied my father to him like an anchor. Elias sat back in his chair, folding his hands together. "We have everything we need to bury him, Chloe. We have the wire fraud, the bank fraud, the embezzlement, and the misappropriation of funds. If we hand this over to the federal authorities right now, Trey will be arrested before the end of the week, and the SEC will freeze every single asset connected to his name." He looked at me, waiting for the order to execute the final strike. I stared at the screen, looking at the foreclosure notices and the wire transfers. "No," I said, my voice steady and completely void of sympathy. "If we go to the feds now, the properties get locked up in federal litigation for years. The bank will auction them off for pennies to recoup their losses, and my mother's legacy will be gone forever. We aren't going to call the authorities. We are going to let them keep digging their own graves." Elias raised an eyebrow, a slow smile spreading across his face as he realized what I was planning. We were going to bypass the government entirely and take control of the execution ourselves. I looked at Elias and outlined the exact parameters of my strategy. We were not going to play the role of the whistleblowers. Whistleblowers get a polite pat on the back, while the massive financial institutions swoop in and seize the underlying assets. I wanted those commercial assets back. I wanted the ultimate leverage. Most importantly, I wanted the absolute and unquestionable power to dictate the exact terms of my family's financial destruction. I instructed Elias to immediately identify the specific institutional lender currently holding the paper on Trey's fraudulent commercial loans. It took Elias less than 10 minutes to pull the origination documents and track the servicer. The lender was a mid-tier regional institution called Southern Meridian Bank. They were a highly aggressive commercial lender that had recently over-leveraged itself trying to compete with the massive national financial players. Consequently, they were currently drowning in toxic commercial real estate debt and desperate to clean up their balance sheets before their upcoming quarterly earnings report. Trey had specifically targeted a bank hungry for high-yield commercial paper, and Southern Meridian had swallowed his fabricated financial projections without conducting the necessary forensic due diligence. I stood up and began pacing the length of the conference room, dictating the legal and corporate maneuvers we needed to execute. We are going to approach Southern Meridian Bank not as a concerned family member, but under the full operational authority of my corporate restructuring firm. We are going to represent a private equity syndicate interested in acquiring a highly specific portfolio of distressed, non-performing commercial loans. I want you to draft a non-disclosure agreement and contact their vice president of commercial lending today. Tell them we have cash on hand and we are willing to acquire the defaulted debt attached to Trey's limited liability company. Elias nodded, his fingers flying across his keyboard as he drafted the preliminary legal correspondence. They are going to jump at this, Chloe, he said, his voice sharp with anticipation. A loan that is 120 days past due is radioactive waste to a mid-tier bank. It forces them to tie up massive amounts of capital in regulatory reserves. If we offer to buy the paper and take the toxic assets completely off their books, they will roll out the red carpet for us. For the next 48 hours, my life became a blur of aggressive corporate warfare. I did not send a single text message to Jerome. I did not answer any of Brenda's passive-aggressive group chat updates about their upcoming extravagant red gala. I completely ignored Jada's social media posts where she continued to flaunt her least luxury goods. Instead, I sat in my office and meticulously dismantled the legal covenants of Trey's commercial loan agreements. I highlighted every single acceleration clause, every cross-collateralization provision, and every default penalty. I was preparing the corporate guillotine, measuring the exact drop required to execute a flawless financial decapitation. My firm had an impeccable reputation in the Atlanta financial sector. When my executive assistant reached out to Southern Meridian Bank, requesting a high-level meeting regarding the acquisition of distressed assets, we were immediately granted an audience with their senior credit committee. They had absolutely no idea that the sharp-suited corporate consultant walking into their boardroom was the biological daughter of the man whose properties they were preparing to seize. They only saw a highly capitalized buyer willing to solve their most pressing financial liability. I spent the evening before the meeting finalizing the financial logistics of the massive acquisition. I logged into my heavily encrypted offshore holding accounts and my private domestic wealth management portfolios. Over the past decade, I had ruthlessly saved and invested every massive corporate bonus, every consulting commission, and every stock dividend I had ever earned. While my family mocked me for living modestly in a luxury high-rise instead of a sprawling suburban mansion, I had been quietly amassing a liquid fortune that rivaled the top executives in my industry. I initiated a series of secure wire transfers, consolidating the necessary capital into a single corporate purchasing account. I was fully prepared to buy my mother's legacy back in straight, untraceable cash. The following morning, Elias and I walked through the heavy glass doors of Southern Meridian Bank. We were escorted directly into a sprawling executive boardroom on the top floor. Sitting across the massive oak table was Harrison Sterling, the senior vice president of commercial lending. Sterling looked exactly like a man desperately trying to hide the fact that his department was bleeding capital. He wore a forced, confident smile, but the dark circles under his eyes betrayed his mounting anxiety over his portfolio's rising default rates. We bypassed the standard corporate pleasantries and opened our financial binders. I took the lead, steering the conversation directly to the toxic assets in question. Mr. Sterling. I began, my tone incredibly crisp and authoritative. My firm represents a private capital syndicate interested in acquiring specific non-performing commercial notes. We have identified a highly distressed package currently lingering on your books, specifically the commercial loans issued to a limited liability company managed by your client Trey. Sterling's forced smile wavered slightly. He shifted in his heavy leather chair, attempting to maintain a strong negotiating position. That particular portfolio is currently undergoing a standard restructuring review, he lied smoothly. The client has experienced some temporary cash flow disruptions due to heavy market acquisitions, but the collateral securing the loan is prime commercial real estate in Decatur and Midtown Atlanta. The paper still holds significant value. I did not even blink. I simply slid a highly detailed forensic audit across the oak table directly into Sterling's hands. I suggest you review our independent analysis, Mr. Sterling, I said, watching the color slowly drain from his face. Your client is not experiencing a temporary cash flow disruption. Your client is operating a massive fraudulent enterprise. He is 120 days delinquent. He has fundamentally falsified his liquidity statements. Furthermore, our investigators have traced the diverted capital from your loan origination directly to offshore accounts and luxury residential leases in South Beach, Florida. He is never going to make another payment on this debt. Elias leaned forward, delivering the legal strike. In approximately 2 weeks, when his early investors realize their money is gone, the federal authorities are going to raid his non-existent offices. When the Federal Bureau of Investigation seizes those commercial properties as proceeds of criminal fraud, your bank will be tied up in federal forfeiture litigation for the next 5 years. You will be forced to write off the entire loan as a total catastrophic loss. Your quarterly earnings report will be decimated, and your shareholders will demand an immediate investigation into your lending practices. Sterling stared at the audit documents, his breathing growing shallow. The illusion of his negotiating power evaporated instantly. He looked at me, his arrogant corporate facade completely shattered by the absolute reality of the impending federal disaster. "What exactly are you offering, Ms. Williams?" he asked, his voice tight and defensive. "I am offering you a clean exit," I replied coldly. "I will purchase the entire debt portfolio today. I will take the non-performing notes, the deeds of trust, and the primary residential collateral completely off your balance sheet before the federal authorities even know this fraud exists. But because this paper is entirely radioactive and fundamentally uncollectible through standard channels, I am not paying anywhere near the face value. I am offering you exactly 12 cents on the dollar." Sterling's jaw dropped. 12 cents. That is an absolute insult. We hold the primary liens on multi-million-dollar commercial lots. I would rather initiate the foreclosure process myself than take a loss of that magnitude. "Then go ahead and initiate the foreclosure," I challenged, standing up and buttoning my tailored blazer. "Let us see how fast your legal department can process the seizures before the federal indictments drop. You have 24 hours before my syndicate withdraws the offer completely. When the federal agents walk through your lobby demanding your underwriting files, do not say we did not offer you a lifeline." I turned and walked toward the boardroom doors with Elias right beside me. We did not even reach the hallway before Sterling called out my name. His voice was laced with pure desperation. "Wait," he said, standing up from the table. "We can draft the assignment of debt agreements this afternoon. If you can guarantee the wire transfer clears by the end of the business day, we will accept the offer." I turned back around, a slow and icy smile forming on my lips. "Have your legal team send the assignment contracts to my partner Elias within the hour." By 4 o'clock that same afternoon, the massive wire transfer had cleared successfully. My hidden wealth had just purchased the entire mountain of toxic debt that Trey had recklessly accumulated. Elias walked into my office and handed me a thick stack of finalized legal documents bearing the official seals of the financial institution. I ran my fingers over the heavy paper. I was now the sole and absolute owner of the commercial promissory notes. I held the primary liens on the Decatur commercial lots and the Midtown Retail Center. And due to the incredibly aggressive cross-collateralization clauses Trey had foolishly signed, I also owned the primary mortgage debt on Jerome's sprawling suburban house. Holding those notarized assignments of debt felt heavier than any corporate acquisition I had ever managed. This was not just business anymore. This was the reclamation of my biological mother's dignity and the ultimate neutralization of Brenda's toxic reign. My phone chimed on the desk with another notification from the church's social media group. Brenda had just posted a sparkling video of the floral arrangements arriving for the upcoming gala. She captioned it, bragging about how her husband and son-in-law were the absolute pillars of the Atlanta business community. She was completely oblivious to the fact that she was decorating a house that she no longer owned. The irony was so rich, it was almost intoxicating. I poured myself a single glass of bourbon, toasting to the silence of my penthouse. The trap was perfectly set. The corporate guillotine was fully loaded, and the blade was razor sharp. All I had to do now was wait for them to place their own heads on the chopping block in front of their entire beloved congregation. The document sat on my desk like a loaded weapon. I spent the next several days auditing the exact parameters of my newly acquired power. As the sole creditor holding the paper on all of Trey's defaulted loans, my legal authority was absolute and terrifyingly comprehensive. By leveraging my mother's stolen equity, Trey had signed away the very foundation of my family's existence. Now that debt belonged entirely to me, I held the primary deed of trust to the Decatur commercial lots, ensuring that my biological mother's legacy was finally insulated from any future manipulation. I held the primary lien on the Midtown Retail Center, effectively placing a financial chokehold on the last remaining profitable asset Jerome possessed. But the most satisfying document in the stack was the mortgage assignment for the sprawling suburban house where Brenda currently reigned supreme. Trey had cross-collateralized everything in his desperate bid to secure cash, and Jerome had blindly signed the guarantor paperwork. Legally speaking, Jerome and Brenda were no longer the masters of their domain. They were merely highly delinquent tenants, living on borrowed time, in a property that my restructuring firm now controlled. I possessed the unilateral authority to file the eviction notices with the county clerk at any given moment. I could have dispatched the local sheriff's deputies to physically remove them from the premises that very afternoon. Furthermore, Trey's phantom real estate investment fund was contractually bound to the debt. By defaulting on the master loan agreement, Trey had triggered the acceleration clauses. I now owned the right to seize all corporate assets associated with his limited liability company. If he had possessed any actual capital or legitimate properties, I could have liquidated them instantly. Since his entire operation was a fabricated shell, I simply held the legal right to completely dissolve his corporate entity and strip him of his fake CEO title. He was a king without a kingdom, entirely at the mercy of the woman his wife loved to humiliate. The monumental power shift was absolute and complete. For my entire life, Brenda had dictated the terms of my existence. She had controlled the narrative, manipulated my father, and weaponized her status to make me feel small. Jada had flaunted her golden child privileges, assuming that her proximity to Brenda made her invincible. Jerome had hidden behind his patriarchal facade, demanding respect, while failing to protect his own flesh and blood. Now the hierarchy was permanently inverted. I held their financial lives in the palm of my hand. I could crush them with a single phone call to my legal team. The profound silence of my penthouse suite felt like a heavy crown settling onto my shoulders. Elias advised me to strike immediately. He wanted to file the foreclosure documents and initiate the asset seizures before Trey could attempt to hide any remaining capital. But I refused. Striking them in private would allow Brenda to spin the narrative. She would paint me as the jealous and vindictive daughter who used corporate loopholes to steal her home. She would play the victim to her church congregation and gather sympathy from the very people she sought to impress. I needed a public arena. I needed an audience that could not be manipulated by her tears. I needed them to construct the highest possible pedestal, so their inevitable fall would be spectacular and undeniable. I instructed Elias to hold all legal filings in a secure vault. We were going to wait. I spent long hours tracing my fingers slowly over the embossed seals of the assignment contracts. The irony was poetic. The very mechanism they used to try and elevate themselves above me was the exact instrument of their impending destruction. They had handed me the master key to their ruin. Every dollar they spent, every breath they took inside that house was now subject to my quiet authorization. I did not feel a shred of guilt. The emotional abuse I had endured for decades had calcified into a thick armor. The little girl who cried in her room when Brenda threw away her art projects was gone. The teenager who begged Jerome to attend her high school graduation was dead. In their place stood a highly capitalized corporate executioner. I locked the documents inside my fireproof safe and focused my attention on the digital world where Brenda was actively setting the stage for her own demise. The waiting game commenced, proving to be the most entertaining phase of my entire strategy. Brenda remained completely oblivious to the financial earthquake rumbling beneath her feet. She treated social media like a continuous reality broadcast. Every morning I sat sipping my espresso, watching her meticulously curated Instagram stories. She heavily promoted an upcoming event dubbed the Red Gala, designed to be Atlanta's social event of the season. The gala served a dual purpose. It was ostensibly a celebration for Jerome's 60th birthday, but the true focus was a grand anniversary celebration for Trey's supposed real estate company. The sheer extravagance was nauseating. Brenda posted daily updates documenting lavish expenditures. She uploaded videos sipping champagne while selecting custom arrangements consisting of thousands of imported red roses. She posted sneak peeks of the venue, a sprawling historic ballroom commanding a massive rental fee. She showcased the custom tuxedo Jerome would wear and the designer gown Jada flew to New York to purchase. Every single element of the party was designed to scream wealth power and untouchable black excellence. I watched these daily videos with a very cold and calculating eye. I knew exactly how this party was being funded. It was paid for by the stolen equity of my biological mother's commercial properties. It was financed by the life savings of the elderly church members Trey had systematically defrauded. They were drinking champagne bought with stolen money and dancing on the financial graves of their victims. The audacity was breathtaking, but it only solidified my resolve. They were building a massive, spectacular balloon of lies, and I was holding a needle. 2 weeks before the event, a heavy envelope arrived in my mailbox. It was crafted from thick premium cardstock, with gleaming gold foil edges and deep red calligraphy. It was an official invitation to the Red Gala. I opened it, and a small handwritten note fluttered out. It was written in Jada's loopy, arrogant handwriting. Dad says we have to invite you to keep up appearances for the church elders. Please dress appropriately and try not to look so miserable. Do not embarrass us. I stared at the note, a genuine laugh escaping my lips. It was the ultimate pity invitation. They were legally bankrupt, drowning in predatory debt, and entirely at the mercy of the federal authorities, but they were still desperately trying to police my behavior and protect their fake image. They truly believed they held the high ground. They thought they were granting the outcast daughter a rare and generous glimpse into their elite world. They wanted me there so they could rub their fabricated success in my face one last time. They wanted me to stand in the corner and watch them be celebrated by hundreds of wealthy and influential guests. I walked over to my desk and picked up a sleek fountain pen. I smoothed out the gold-embossed response card. There was a small box designated for those attending with pleasure. I checked the box with bold, deliberate strokes. I filled in my name and indicated that I would be bringing one guest. Elias had already agreed to accompany me, acting as my legal counsel and personal witness to the impending devastation. I slid the response card into the pre-stamped envelope and sealed it shut. I walked down to the lobby and dropped the envelope directly into the outgoing mail slot. The trap was now fully operational. Brenda and Jerome were about to host the most expensive and highly publicized party of their entire lives. They had invited all the local politicians, the church elite, and the top-tier business leaders of Atlanta. They had gathered the perfect audience for my presentation. I spent the remaining 2 weeks refining my final strike. I coordinated with Elias to ensure every legal document was perfectly formatted for public display. I digitized the foreclosure notices, the bank assignments, and the fraudulent wire transfers. I compiled the audio recordings and the undeniable proof of Trey's offshore accounts. I was not just going to confront them directly. I was going to deliver a flawless, highly produced corporate presentation that would leave absolutely zero room for denial or manipulation. The silence from my end was deafening, but it was the silence of a predator waiting for the prey to step directly into the snare. The Red Gala was rapidly approaching, and I was fully prepared to burn their fake empire to ashes in front of everyone they had ever tried to impress. The night of the Red Gala arrived with a suffocating humidity that hung heavily over the city of Atlanta. The venue Brenda had selected was the historic Piedmont Grand Ballroom, a sprawling architectural masterpiece that commanded an astronomical rental fee. As Elias and I pulled up to the valet stand, the sheer scale of my family's financial delusion was on full display. A line of leased luxury vehicles stretched down the block. Valets sprinted back and forth, opening doors for local politicians, mega-church pastors, and the self-proclaimed elite of the city's social circles. Everyone was dressed to the absolute nines, dripping in designer labels and heavy jewelry. It was a masterclass in performing wealth. I stepped out of Elias's sleek, understated town car. I had chosen my attire with meticulous precision. While Brenda and Jada preferred loud, flashy brands that screamed for attention, I wore a custom-tailored emerald green evening gown. It possessed no visible logos, just flawless architectural lines and silk that draped perfectly. I wore a single pair of authentic diamond drop earrings and a vintage Cartier watch. Elias stood beside me in a sharp midnight blue suit, looking every bit the lethal corporate attorney he was. He held a slim leather briefcase in his left hand. Inside that briefcase was the highly explosive payload we were about to drop on this entire masquerade. We bypassed the crowded red carpet entrance and slipped quietly through the heavy brass doors of the ballroom. The interior was a dizzying spectacle of faux luxury. Massive crystal chandeliers cast a warm golden glow over hundreds of guests. 10-foot-tall floral arrangements of imported red roses dominated every single table. Waiters in crisp white tuxedos circulated through the crowd, carrying silver trays loaded with champagne flutes and expensive hors d'oeuvres. A 12-piece string quartet played modern rhythm and blues hits in the corner. Brenda had spared absolutely no expense using the stolen equity of my biological mother's legacy to fund this theatrical production. Elias and I navigated toward the back of the room, intentionally avoiding the heavily photographed VIP section near the main stage. We found a quiet, elevated alcove near the mahogany bar that offered a perfect vantage point of the entire ballroom. I accepted a glass of sparkling water from a passing waiter and simply watched the performance unfold. Jerome stood near the center of the room, surrounded by a circle of local business owners. He was wearing a custom maroon velvet tuxedo jacket, looking incredibly stiff and uncomfortable. He kept dabbing his forehead with a silk handkerchief, his smile forced and rigid. He was supposed to be the guest of honor celebrating his 60th birthday, but he looked like a man standing on the gallows waiting for the lever to be pulled. He knew his retail business was failing. He knew he had signed away his commercial properties. The crushing weight of the impending foreclosure was completely visible in his exhausted eyes. Trey, on the other hand, was actively working the room with desperate manic energy. He was holding a glass of brown liquor and speaking loudly to a group of elderly church deacons. He was sweating profusely, his eyes darting frantically toward the entrance every time the heavy brass doors opened. He was terrified that his aggressive loan sharks or federal agents might walk through those doors at any moment. Jada clung tightly to his arm, wearing an ostentatious, sparkling red gown covered in sequins. She was aggressively flashing her massive engagement ring at anyone who would look completely unaware that her husband was a financial corpse. And then there was Brenda. She was floating through the crowd like a reigning monarch. She wore a heavy, beaded gold and crimson dress, moving from group to group, accepting compliments and basking in the manufactured adoration of her peers. This was her ultimate fantasy realized. She was the center of attention, the matriarch of a supposedly untouchable empire of black excellence. She laughed loudly, hugging local politicians and posing for the professional photographers she had hired to document her social triumph. "Look at them," Elias murmured, leaning close, so only I could hear his voice over the swelling music. "They are completely oblivious. It is like watching passengers arrange deck chairs on a sinking ship." I took a slow sip of my water, my eyes tracking Brenda's movements across the ballroom floor. "They are not oblivious, Elias. They are actively choosing delusion. They prefer the comfortable lie of this ballroom over the harsh reality of their bank accounts. But reality has a very strict collection policy. At precisely 9 o'clock, the string quartet abruptly stopped playing. The heavy ambient lighting in the ballroom dimmed, leaving only the bright dramatic spotlights focused directly on the main stage. A ripple of anticipation moved through the crowd as guests turned their attention toward the front of the room. Brenda stepped up to the microphone, grasping the silver stand with both hands. She beamed out at the sea of faces soaking in the absolute silence of the room. She was entirely in her element, completely intoxicated by the attention of the Atlanta elite. "Good evening, family, friends, and distinguished guests." Brenda began, her voice echoing through the state-of-the-art sound system. She used her heavily practiced church cadence, pausing dramatically for effect. We are gathered here tonight in this beautiful venue to celebrate a massive milestone. My wonderful husband Jerome is turning 60 years old today. Please give it up for the patriarch of our family. The room erupted in polite applause. Jerome offered a weak, strained wave from his table, sitting heavily in his chair. But Brenda did not linger on him for long. Her true agenda was to validate her own social standing by elevating her golden child. But tonight is not just about looking back at the past. Brenda continued, her voice rising with manufactured passion. Tonight is about looking forward to the future. It is about celebrating the powerful continuation of our family legacy. We are also here to celebrate the tremendous corporate anniversary of my brilliant son-in-law Trey and his rapidly expanding real estate investment firm. She gestured grandly toward Trey and Jada, who stood up and waved to the cheering crowd. Jada blew kisses while Trey raised his glass of liquor, masking his absolute panic with a wide fake smile. When I look at Jada and Trey, Brenda projected into the microphone, I see the absolute pinnacle of Black excellence. I see a young, powerful couple who understand the deep importance of building and maintaining generational wealth. Trey is out here dominating the commercial real estate market, securing the bag, and elevating our entire family to a completely new tax bracket. And my beautiful Jada is standing right beside him, a perfect supportive wife, proving that behind every powerful Black man is a loyal, dedicated woman who understands the assignment. The church aunties in the front row murmured their loud agreements, shouting words of affirmation. Brenda paused, soaking up the validation. Then her eyes began scanning the crowded ballroom. She was actively searching for her designated target. She wanted to contrast her golden child against her ultimate scapegoat. Her gaze swept over the tables, past the ice sculptures, and finally locked directly onto me, standing in the dimly lit alcove at the back of the room. A sharp, vicious smirk crossed her face. She gripped the microphone tighter, leaning forward. Now, I know many of you are aware that we have another daughter in the family, Brenda said, her tone dripping with heavy, condescending pity. My stepdaughter, Chloe, is standing all the way in the back tonight. Chloe, sweetheart, we see you back there. Hundreds of heads swiveled in my direction. The spotlight operator aggressively swung a bright beam of light across the room, illuminating Elias and me in the back corner. The sudden attention was designed to make me feel small, isolated, and deeply embarrassed. I did not flinch. I kept my posture perfectly straight, and my expression entirely unreadable. We are so glad Chloe could take a break from her lonely corporate job to join us. Brenda continued, her voice laced with venomous passive aggression. It is hard for her sometimes. It is hard for an independent woman to see her younger sister happily married to a successful, wealthy man while she sits alone. But we are a praying family. We pray Chloe learns from her sister how to build generational wealth instead of pushing family away. We pray God softens her bitter and jealous heart so she can finally understand that a woman is absolutely nothing without the love and protection of a strong family unit. A collective, uncomfortable murmur rippled through the ballroom. Even some of the politicians shifted awkwardly in their seats, realizing Brenda was using a microphone to publicly execute her own stepdaughter. Jada was visibly holding back a laugh, leaning her head against Trey's shoulder. Jerome was staring at the tablecloth, completely refusing to intervene and stop his wife's cruel public tirade. Elias tensed beside me, his jaw clenching in anger at the blatant disrespect. He looked at me, waiting for a reaction. I simply handed him my glass of sparkling water. I reached down and smoothed the fabric of my emerald gown. The moment had finally arrived. Brenda had constructed the highest possible pedestal. She had gathered the perfect audience of elites, pastors, and politicians. She had handed me the absolute perfect opening to deliver the financial fatal blow. I looked at Elias and gave him a single sharp nod. Open the briefcase. I instructed, my voice completely steady and cold. It is time to teach my family a real lesson about generational wealth. The entire ballroom held its breath, waiting for my reaction to Brenda's deeply calculated and vicious insult. I did not give them tears, and I did not give them anger. I simply smiled, a brilliant and completely unbothered smile that caused a visible ripple of unease to pass through the front tables. I handed my sparkling water to Elias, who took it with a knowing nod. I smoothed the lines of my emerald gown and began walking deliberately toward the main stage. The silence in the room deepened with every step I took. The rhythmic clicking of my heels echoed across the polished hardwood floor. As I approached the front, Brenda visibly stiffened her grip on the microphone, tightening until her knuckles turned white. She had fully expected me to either flee the room in tears or launch into an embarrassing defensive screaming match. She had absolutely no protocol prepared for my quiet and steady advance. I walked up the short flight of stairs and stepped directly onto the stage, entering the harsh glare of the spotlight. I stopped a few feet away from Brenda, extending my hand. She hesitated, her eyes darting nervously toward Jerome, but the sheer social pressure of hundreds of watching guests forced her to surrender the microphone. I took it from her, stepping confidently into the exact center of the stage. The DJ stationed at a booth just to my right watched me warily. I reached into the small hidden pocket of my gown and pulled out a sleek silver USB drive. I handed it to the DJ, gesturing toward his laptop and the massive digital projector screen currently displaying a generic monogram of Jerome's initials. I looked out at the sea of expectant faces, scanning the politicians, the pastors, and the elite business owners who had gathered to worship at the altar of my family's fake empire. I found Trey and Jada sitting at the VIP table. Trey was sweating so profusely his designer shirt was stained, and Jada looked deeply confused. Finally, I turned my gaze back to Brenda, who was standing frozen at the edge of the stage. "Thank you for that incredibly warm introduction, Brenda." I began, my voice ringing clear and authoritative through the massive speakers. "It is truly inspiring to hear you speak so passionately about building and protecting family assets. You mentioned that I should be taking notes on how Trey and Jada are establishing generational wealth. I thought that was excellent advice. In fact, I have been taking very detailed notes for the past several weeks." I turned toward the DJ. "If you would please load the presentation." The DJ hesitated for a fraction of a second before plugging the USB drive into his system. The massive screen behind me flickered, going dark for a moment before snapping back to life. A collective gasp rippled through the ballroom as the first slide illuminated the stage. It was not a celebratory montage of family photos. It was a high-resolution, highly magnified scan of official legal documents. "Let us look closely at Trey's portfolio," I continued, my voice dropping into the clinical and precise cadence of a corporate auditor delivering a terminal diagnosis. "What you are looking at, ladies and gentlemen, are the official stamped and verified notices of foreclosure. These documents were issued by Southern Meridian Bank, targeting 3 primary commercial properties in Decatur and Midtown Atlanta." I paused, letting the audience absorb the dense legal text displayed behind me. I saw several prominent local business owners leaning forward, their expressions shifting from polite interest to absolute shock. "These properties represent the foundational wealth of my biological mother's legacy." I explained, the cold fury simmering beneath my calm exterior. "As you can see from the attached quitclaim deeds, my father Jerome quietly and illegally transferred the full equity of these assets into a phantom limited liability company controlled entirely by his son-in-law Trey. Trey then used these properties to secure massive predatory commercial loans that he has not made a single payment on in over 120 days. The bank was preparing to seize every single asset, including the sprawling suburban house my parents currently sleep in." Jerome slumped heavily in his chair, looking as though he had been physically struck. Brenda clutched her chest, her mouth opening and closing like a fish suffocating on dry land. But I was just getting started. I clicked a small remote in my hand, advancing the presentation to the next slide. The screen shifted, displaying a dense grid of highlighted banking transactions and offshore wire transfer records. "Now, you might be asking yourselves," I projected into the microphone, pacing slowly across the stage, "where exactly did all that borrowed millions of dollars go? Did it go into expanding Trey's supposedly booming real estate investment fund? Did it go into developing new commercial properties to secure the legacy of the Blackwell family?" I gestured toward the screen. "Please direct your attention to the highlighted outgoing transfers." The crowd was absolutely silent, completely captivated by the financial autopsy unfolding before them. As you can clearly see from these verified bank statements I stated, pointing directly at the massive numbers, the capital was immediately diverted into dozens of untraceable shell accounts. From there, hundreds of thousands of dollars were wired directly to a luxury condominium lease in South Beach, Florida. Furthermore, we have documented massive expenditures at high-end jewelry boutiques, luxury auto leasing agencies, and yacht charter companies. I locked eyes with Jada, whose face had drained of all color. She was staring at the screen, her entire world shattering in real time. Trey did not use my father's assets to build wealth, I announced, my voice echoing like thunder. He used my father's assets to run a massive Ponzi scheme within this very community and to finance a lavish secret lifestyle for his mistress in Miami. Jada dropped her crystal champagne flute. The glass shattered violently against the floor, the sound cutting through the stunned silence of the ballroom. She turned to Trey, screaming hysterically, hitting his chest with her fists. Trey frantically tried to restrain her, his eyes wild with absolute terror. The facade was completely broken. The elite crowd began murmuring loudly, the whispers escalating into a cacophony of outrage and disbelief, as elderly church members realized their own investments were tied to the man currently being exposed as a massive fraud. Brenda finally snapped out of her paralyzed state. She lunged toward me desperately, trying to grab the microphone from my hands. "Stop it!" she shrieked, her carefully curated image completely destroyed. "You are lying. You are fabricating these documents to ruin us. Someone turn off that screen." I stepped smoothly out of her reach, maintaining my absolute composure. "I am not lying, Brenda," I said, my voice slicing through her hysteria. "And just in case anyone in this room still doubts the validity of these documents, I have one final piece of evidence to share." I clicked the remote one last time. The screen went black, but the audio system kicked in. A harsh, desperate voice filled the ballroom. It was Trey's voice, completely stripped of his usual arrogant swagger. He was sobbing, his words slurred with panic and terror. "Please, man, you have to give me more time." The recorded voicemail played, echoing off the high ceilings. "I know I missed the last 3 payments, but I am tapped out. The old man transferred the deeds, but the bank is freezing the accounts. I cannot access the equity. Please do not send your guys to the house. I will get the money, I swear to God. I will bleed the church fund dry if I have to. Just give me 1 more week, please." The recording ended, leaving a devastating and profound silence in its wake. The reality of the situation crashed down upon the entire room. Trey was not a wealthy mogul. He was a desperate, terrified criminal begging violent loan sharks for his life, and he had explicitly admitted to planning to defraud the church congregation to save his own skin. Trey scrambled out of his chair, shoving past Jada and sprinting toward the heavy brass exit doors. The panic in his eyes was absolute. He knew that his empire of lies had just been incinerated, and the fallout was going to be catastrophic. But I had anticipated every single move. As Trey reached the back of the room, the doors swung open, blocking his escape. Elias stepped forward, flanked by a team of private security contractors I had quietly hired for the evening. Elias held up a thick stack of legal folders, his expression completely stoic. He motioned for the security team to detain Trey, who immediately began thrashing and shouting as they pinned his arms behind his back. I stood in the center of the stage, the absolute master of the chaos unfolding around me. I had promised them a lesson in elite wealth building, and I had delivered a masterclass in total financial destruction. But the true execution, the ultimate flex of power, was still waiting to be delivered. I raised the microphone to my lips, preparing to drop the final guillotine blade on their completely shattered reality. I looked out at the absolute devastation I had just orchestrated. The recorded voice of Trey begging for his life had barely faded from the massive ballroom speakers when the physical reality of the situation took over the room. The polished facade of black excellence they had meticulously constructed over decades was actively disintegrating in front of hundreds of horrified witnesses. Jada stood frozen at the VIP table, her hands trembling violently as the truth of her marriage finally registered in her mind. A high-pitched, agonizing sound escaped her throat. The crystal champagne flute slipped from her fingers, crashing against the polished hardwood floor and shattering into 100 glittering pieces. She lunged forward, her heavily sequined red gown catching the bright stage lights as she sprinted toward the back of the room where Trey was being held. She began screaming hysterically, pounding her fists aggressively against his chest, while the private security contractors held him firmly in place. "You lied to me," she shrieked, her voice cracking with raw, unadulterated hysteria. "You told me we were incredibly rich. You used my father's money to buy a luxury condo for a mistress in Miami." Jada was completely unhinged, her perfectly curated image of a wealthy and supportive wife dissolving into a public tantrum of sheer and utter humiliation. Trey was thrashing wildly against the broad-shouldered security guards, his custom-tailored linen suit jacket tearing audibly at the shoulder seam. He was shouting loud profanities, threatening to sue everyone in the building, but his empty legal threats only made him look increasingly pathetic. The violent loan sharks he feared so deeply were likely watching this very spectacle unfold, or would soon hear about his complete financial exposure. He was a trapped rat, and the absolute panic in his wide eyes confirmed every single document I had just displayed on the projector screen. Jerome was faring no better at his assigned table of honor. My father had collapsed heavily back into his velvet dining chair, his face draining of all remaining color until he looked entirely ashen. He clutched his chest tightly with both hands, his breathing coming in short and desperate gasps. Several prominent church elders rushed to his side, quickly loosening his custom maroon velvet tie and fanning him rapidly with expensive cardstock dinner menus. He was not experiencing a cardiac event, but rather a massive full-blown panic attack. The supposed patriarch of the family, the man who had cowardly traded his biological daughter's legacy for the fleeting approval of his superficial wife, was finally suffocating under the immense weight of his own terrible choices. He looked up toward the stage, his eyes meeting mine, pleading silently for a mercy he absolutely did not deserve. I offered him none. I simply stared back down at him, my expression completely devoid of any sympathy or familial warmth. Brenda, however, was entirely incapable of accepting defeat gracefully. Her survival instinct was deeply rooted in aggression and intense denial. She shoved forcefully past the wealthy politicians and the shocked pastors, her heavy beaded crimson gown swishing aggressively as she stomped toward the main stage. Her face was contorted into a terrifying mask of pure and unadulterated rage. She climbed the short flight of stairs with frightening speed, lunging directly at me like a cornered predator. She threw her hands out desperately, trying to snatch the microphone away from my firm grip. "It is a lie," she screamed, her voice shrill and desperate, echoing loudly through the massive ballroom. "She is a jealous and bitter liar. Do not listen to a single word she says. This is all completely fabricated to ruin our beautiful family." I sidestepped her frantic physical grab, effortlessly maintaining my secure hold on the microphone. Brenda stumbled forward blindly, her expensive designer heels catching awkwardly on the thick stage carpeting. She nearly fell completely to her knees before catching herself heavily on the wooden podium. The elite crowd watched this physical altercation in absolute horror. The powerful and feared matriarch of the Greater Zion Fellowship, the woman who had just lectured them all on generational wealth and social standing, was now physically fighting her own stepdaughter on stage to protect a fraudulent criminal empire. The pastors and local politicians who had eagerly praised her just 30 minutes ago were now actively backing away from her table, whispering furiously to one another behind their hands. Their heavy judgment was a palpable force in the room. The entire ballroom had devolved into utter chaos. The wealthy church aunties were clutching their pearls and fanning themselves aggressively, muttering prayers and spreading instant gossip in the exact same breath. Local business owners who had strongly considered investing their hard-earned capital with Trey were aggressively pulling out their cell phones, stepping out into the hallways to call their wealth managers to ensure their own portfolios were fully secure. The sheer magnitude of the public scandal was intoxicating to witness. Brenda regained her physical balance and turned back to face me, her eyes wild and bloodshot with fury. "You are a terrible monster," she hissed loudly, spitting the words directly at my face. "You planned this whole evil display to humiliate us tonight. You are actively trying to destroy the Blackwell name in this city." I looked calmly at the panicked and frantic woman standing before me. I did not destroy the Blackwell name, Brenda, I said, my voice projecting clearly over the microphone, easily cutting through the loud noise of the chaotic ballroom. You and Jerome did that all by yourselves when you decided to finance your luxury lifestyle with stolen equity and incredibly cheap lies. I am just the auditor presenting the final invoice for your greed. Down on the main floor, Elias signaled to the security team to hold Trey completely secure while he confidently strode toward the front of the room. He walked up the stage stairs carrying a thick stack of heavy legal folders. His midnight blue suit was immaculate, his presence radiating pure and undeniable corporate authority. He stopped right beside me, placing the large stack of legal documents deliberately onto the podium. He handed me the top folder, opening it to reveal the highly specialized assignment of debt contracts bearing the official embossed gold seals of Southern Meridian Bank. I held the thick legal document up high for the entire ballroom to see clearly. The loud murmuring in the crowd instantly died down to a hush. Everyone in that room recognized the heavy and serious weight of an official legal filing. Brenda stared at the open folder, her chest heaving, her eyes darting nervously between Elias and me. "You keep talking about family assets, Brenda," I said, my voice dropping into a deadly serious and commanding register. "You keep talking loudly about how you and Jerome are the masters of this incredible empire of wealth. But you failed to understand the most basic rule of corporate finance. When you default on a highly leveraged predatory commercial loan, you no longer own anything. The bank owns you." I took a slow and deliberate step toward her, backing her toward the very edge of the stage. "But Southern Meridian Bank did not want to hold your radioactive toxic debt anymore, Brenda. They were incredibly desperate to offload it before the federal authorities raided Trey's non-existent strip mall offices. So the bank sold your defaulted debt. They sold every single promissory note, every cross-collateralization agreement, and every primary lien attached to your name. And as of yesterday afternoon, my corporate restructuring firm owns all of it outright." The absolute shock that washed over Brenda's face was a brilliant masterpiece. Her jaw dropped completely open, all the color instantly draining from her skin until she looked entirely ghost-like. Down on the floor, Jerome stopped gasping for air and stared up at me in sheer, terrified silence. Jada stopped hitting Trey and turned around slowly, her mouth hanging open in disbelief. I raised the microphone, bringing it close to my lips to deliver the final killing financial blow. "I own this historic venue we are standing in right now," I stated, my voice ringing with undeniable absolute power. "I own the commercial lots in Decatur. I own the highly profitable Midtown Retail Center. And because Trey was foolish enough to aggressively leverage your primary residence, and Jerome was cowardly enough to sign the guarantor paperwork, I own the $10 million Buckhead mansion you were planning to buy, and I own the sprawling suburban house you currently sleep in tonight." I paused intentionally, letting the crushing reality of my words settle heavily over the completely silent ballroom. "You have exactly 48 hours to vacate my properties," I declared, staring directly into Brenda's terrified and wide eyes. "You will leave the house keys on the kitchen counter. You will not take a single piece of furniture or a single fixture that was purchased with my stolen equity. If you are not completely off my premises by Monday morning, I will have the county sheriff physically remove you, and your cheap belongings will be placed unceremoniously on the public curb." The elite crowd was absolutely stunned into total paralysis. The grand illusion of Black excellence, the pervasive myth of the untouchable wealthy family, the entire flawless performance they had been fed for years was completely and utterly shattered into dust. The ambitious politicians who had eagerly taken photos with Jerome earlier in the evening were now actively deleting the images from their phones to distance themselves from the fraud. The prominent pastors who had loudly praised Brenda's charity work were shaking their heads in total disgust. They were looking at a family of pathetic frauds who had just been legally, financially, and publicly executed by the very daughter they had treated like garbage for decades. Brenda fell heavily to her knees right there on the stage, weeping openly and clutching her face in her hands. The mighty matriarch had been reduced to a sobbing trespasser. The entire ballroom watched in absolute stunned silence as the greatest financial illusion in Atlanta society was permanently destroyed, leaving nothing but the pathetic and undeniable truth. Down below, Trey realized the private security guards were leading him toward the main brass doors. In a sudden, frantic burst of pure adrenaline, he violently shoved his shoulder into the guard holding his right arm. He burst through the heavy front doors of the Piedmont Grand Ballroom, sprinting out into the sweltering Atlanta night air. He thought he could reach the valet stand, jump into his leased sports car, and disappear into the city before my corporate lawyers could officially file the paperwork. He was completely wrong. As Trey bolted down the sweeping concrete stairs toward the crowded parking lot, red and blue police lights suddenly ignited, illuminating the entire street. Elias had not just brought legal folders to the gala tonight. My brilliant law partner had placed a highly detailed phone call to the Federal Bureau of Investigation early yesterday morning, providing them with the exact routing numbers and digital footprints of Trey's massive wire fraud. 3 black sport utility vehicles screeched to a halt directly in front of the valet stand, blocking any possible exit route. Heavily armed federal agents wearing tactical vests poured out of the vehicles surrounding Trey instantly. "Get on the ground right now!" an agent shouted, his voice booming through the humid night air. Trey froze, his chest heaving as the reality of a federal indictment crashed into him. The elite guests of the Red Gala, including the megachurch pastors and local politicians, poured out of the ballroom and onto the front steps, watching the spectacle unfold. Jida pushed her way to the front of the crowd, screaming hysterically as the federal agents forcefully pushed Trey onto the hood of his own leased luxury car. They snapped heavy metal handcuffs around his wrists, the sharp click of the locking mechanism echoing loudly across the silent parking lot. He was not a high-rolling real estate mogul anymore. He was just a common thief being hauled away in front of his entire congregation. I stood at the top of the ballroom steps, watching the federal vehicles speed away into the night, carrying the fake king of our family straight to a federal holding cell. The flashing sirens painted Jada's tear-stained face in harsh red and blue light. I turned my back on the wreckage and walked to my waiting town car, leaving them entirely alone in the dark. I took a deep breath of the humid summer air, feeling a profound sense of closure washing over my entire body. The flashing lights of the police cruisers gradually faded into the distance, taking the last remnants of my family's fake prestige with them. Jada was still screaming on the pavement, completely oblivious to the fact that her entire reality had just been destroyed. I did not look back at her. She had chosen her path, and now she was forced to walk it entirely alone. The chapter of their false dominance was officially closed. 3 days passed since the spectacular collapse of the Red Gala. The eviction notices had been officially served and posted on the front door of their sprawling suburban house. I was sitting at the expansive glass desk in my corporate office reviewing an acquisition portfolio when my executive assistant buzzed my intercom. She informed me that my father and stepmother were standing in the lobby aggressively demanding a meeting. I told her to send them in. The heavy mahogany doors of my office swung open, and Jerome and Brenda walked inside. The arrogant posture and aggressive superiority were completely gone. Brenda looked disheveled, her hair flat and her eyes swollen from days of relentless crying. Jerome looked hollowed out, his shoulders slumped, as if the physical weight of his monumental failure was crushing his spine. They stood awkwardly in front of my desk, clutching their hands together like children. "Chloe, please." Jerome began, his voice trembling with raw desperation. "You have to stop the eviction. The sheriff's deputies are coming tomorrow morning. My retail business accounts are completely frozen because they were tied to Trey's fraudulent network. We do not even have enough cash to rent a cheap motel room." Brenda stepped forward, tears streaming down her face. Her pride was entirely broken. "Chloe, I am begging you," she sobbed, her voice cracking. "I know I made mistakes. I know I was hard on you, but we are family. You cannot just throw your own parents out onto the street. We raised you. We put a roof over your head. Please have mercy on us. You cannot do this to your own flesh and blood." I looked at the two people who had spent my entire life making me feel completely worthless. I felt absolutely zero emotion. There was no anger, no sadness, and certainly no pity. The well of my empathy had run completely dry. I folded my hands together on top of the glass desk and met Brenda's desperate gaze with absolute sub-zero coldness. "Family makes room for you at the table, Brenda," I said, my voice perfectly level and devoid of any warmth. "You made it very clear in Miami that I was not family. You told the entire church congregation that I was a bitter and jealous outsider. You told me to figure my own life out, and you officially cut me off to protect a federal criminal. You chose your side and you bet everything on a losing hand. You do not get to claim the privileges of family only when you are facing complete ruin." Jerome fell to his knees right there on the pristine carpet of my corporate office, weeping openly. "Chloe, I am your father," he pleaded. "I gave you life. You gave me genetics, Jerome," I corrected him sharply, refusing to look away. "You never gave me protection. You never gave me loyalty. You handed the legacy of my biological mother over to a con artist just to buy this woman a shiny new mansion. The eviction stands. You have exactly 24 hours to remove your belongings from my property. Now get out of my office before I have security escort you out of the building." My voice left absolutely no room for any further debate. I pressed the intercom, silently summoning my security team to handle the immediate removal. The doors clicked shut, sealing them out of my life forever. I did not watch them leave. I stood up from my chair and walked slowly toward the massive floor-to-ceiling windows of my high-rise office. I pushed open the door and stepped out onto the balcony. The breeze swept past me, carrying faint sounds of the city below. I leaned against the railing, looking out over the urban skyline. For generations, society has heavily relied upon the toxic trope of the strong black woman. We are conditioned to carry the unbearable weight of our entire families on our shoulders. We are taught to endure disrespect, to swallow our trauma, and to finance the delusions of the people around us, all in the name of unwavering loyalty. We are told that our ultimate strength lies in our infinite capacity to endure endless suffering without ever uttering a single complaint. We are expected to build castles for people who would not even give us a single brick. But as I stood there breathing in the fresh air, I realized that profound narrative was nothing but a manipulative trap designed to keep us entirely subjugated. True strength does not mean carrying toxic people on your back until your spine physically snaps. True strength is having the absolute courage to drop them. It is looking at the people who demand your sacrifice and calmly telling them no. It is refusing to let your hard-earned success become the funding mechanism for someone else's fraudulent ego. By letting Jerome and Brenda fall, I had not failed as a daughter. I had finally succeeded as a human being. The financial empire they thought they controlled was now completely dismantled and safely resting in my highly capable hands. I had reclaimed my biological mother's legacy and secured my own future, all without raising my voice or shedding a single tear. I had weaponized their own greed against them and executed a flawless corporate restructuring of my own personal life. The heavy, oppressive dark clouds that had shadowed my entire existence had finally broken, revealing a brilliantly clear sky. I looked out at the endless horizon, feeling a deep and profound sense of peace settling into my bones. The heavy chain of familial obligation was permanently shattered. I closed my eyes and let a genuine, beautiful smile spread across my face, finally free. I stood on that balcony for a long time, watching the city lights begin to flicker on as the evening approached. The air felt incredibly light, and every breath I took was a quiet celebration of my hard-won independence. I was no longer a victim trapped in a cycle of emotional abuse. I was the sole architect of my own absolute destiny. The skyline stretched endlessly before me, a vast canvas of infinite possibilities that belonged to no one else but me. The past was successfully liquidated and my future was absolutely and completely pristine.